Good morning. Um, we are going to, as this title slide says, talk about gambling. We're going to review many of the things that we have talked about during the course of this novel so far. It's the second part of it, or a review of it. I stole a part due from a bad satire uh, from the 1990s, I believe. The title there was incorrect, and I'm pretty sure it's incorrect here, but nonetheless, it allowed me to wax nostalgic, and so we're going from to work on that. First, quickly, remember the due dates, the annotated bib, the extra credit, uh, the final research paper. Those are all due at 11:59 p.m. Remember that the quiz over the life we bury is on the 12th. Those of you who are scheduled for the writing lab, please come to the writing lab prepared to ask a couple of questions so we can go through some specifics over your paper. And then we can get the quiz done in class uh, for you guys as well. The reading assignments are over on the right-hand side. I know that on the 17th, it looks like there's a lot of reading, but remember, we don't have class on the 15th, and I had put in reading assignments for that as well. Remember that The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is a history slash biography slash memoir. It is not a novel. So far, I believe we have studied character, we have studied conflict, we have studied connection, we have studied theme, we have done formulas, we have done verisimilitude, we have done tone. I'm not going to go through part two of all of them today, but there are a few highlights that I want to hit on, a few things I want to build on from what we've done before. When we've talked about the conflicts, we've talked about person versus person, and we've talked about um, person versus self. There's internal conflicts. The novel, I think, adds an environmental conflict, person versus the environment, in the sections that you've been reading lately. And remember that the purpose of conflicts, and I don't think I've talked about this enough, the purpose of conflict is to drive the plot by producing suspense until we get to the novel's climax. The purpose of conflicts is to keep you reading, and they probably need to be believable or you won't keep reading. But the purpose of the conflict is to keep the person turning the pages, to keep the person wondering what's happening next, and to provide a sense of surprise. Carl's fight with cancer, the actual battles in Vietnam, Joe's inner conflict about his responsibility to Jeremy. I think we've talked about those a little bit already. Lila versus her past, I believe we've mentioned. Joe versus his mother, we've certainly mentioned. The legal system, Joe versus the blizzard. So I think we can take cancer as an environmental thing. We can take blizzard as an environmental thing. The battles in Vietnam are person versus person. Joe's inner conflicts or Lila's conflict versus her past are person versus self. And so I think you see that one of the things I think Eskins does very well is he makes sure that there are different types of conflicts. I think he drills deeply enough into each one so that we're invested, but there are different types of conflicts to keep us reading, keep us turning the pages. Remember, we talked about theme being a critical belief about human existence that the author is trying to convey. I believe I've mentioned these things on the right-hand side of the slide before. All elements of the literary work should contribute to it. It should be a complete sentence, not a single word. It should apply to the real world, not just the novel. And we should avoid cliches. In one of the previous presentations, we talked about the idea that sometimes theme is stated directly or close to be stating directly, the idea of no one gets through life unscathed. And then I talked about the fact that we should avoid the cliches with that. Sometimes, however, I think with repeated sentences, one has to look at inferences. And so, for example, as we're getting through these two sentences that are on the slide right now, you spent all that time in prison for a crime you didn't commit. That's just wrong. When they arrested me for the murder of Crystal Hagen, well, I think part of me figured it was time to pay my debt. And so now you have these two different situations here of paying the debt and right and wrong. I believe there are lots of other sentences like that throughout the book. And as you take the inference, I think that justice is what they're talking about. The simplest definition of justice has always been to render each his due. And so when you're looking at the idea of justice and the idea of rendering due, paying the price, right and wrong, justice can be the subject of both quotations. But when you're going to write the theme, you're not going to write the single word justice. Theme is going to be what point are both quotations making about justice? And I think always asking what point do all of these combined elements, whether it's characterization, whether it's inferences you can draw from from statements, whether it's a direct statement of the novel, whether it's the final resolution of the novel, what point does everything make about the subject matter, whether it's justice or whether it's vengeance or whether it's love or whether it's responsibility? What's the point? And take the whole novel into consideration as you're thinking about that. We talked a lot about detective formulas. And I think as we take a look here, I tried to point out, I think in that first presentation, and I'm going to remind you here again, that I think Eskins maybe is trying to do a little bit too much by borrowing parts of all three detective formulas. For example, I think he uses the traditional, I think he uses the hard boiled, and I think he uses bits of the police procedural. Joe certainly doesn't have superior powers of mind and detection. We don't seem to have an emphasis on features or habits. Joe's the narrator, so the sidekick isn't the bold admirer. Although Carl didn't do the crime, we're not focusing on inept cops very much. Joe certainly isn't in the upper class, and nobody's going to gather the people together to explain how he solved the crime. None of those things are happening in the novel. However, there was a seemingly perfect crime, the murder of Crystal Hagen. As we're going through, we're trying to solve the puzzle with Joe. All of the clues are presented to us at least by, halfway through the novel. A lot of those clues are misleading. We do have a false arrest with Carl, and I don't think anybody's lying. Carl's certainly not lying when he tells his story. Uh, Joe doesn't seem to be lying to us. So those elements of the traditional formula are used. The hard boiled formula, there aren't any clear good guys. I mean, Joe seems to be struggling with the concept of how he should treat his brother. We are focusing, I think, on Joe's growth as a character. I think we do focus on Lila's character. I think we try to figure out who Carl is. The detective's not averse to violence. Joe's got a favored move. He hits people. The emotions, I don't think, are super huge, except for the play. Most of the time, they're pretty flat. Minneapolis, for the upper Midwest, is the metropolitan area, and Joe tries to be smart alecky several times in the novel. Whether he's successful is a little different, but he certainly tries to be smart alecky. I think the key element of the hard-boiled detective novel is the personal code, and here I think is where Joe certainly fits. He's got this naive belief that right and wrong should balance out in the end, and faced with a choice of to act or to wait, I felt I had no choice but to act. Both of those are on page 202, but that seems to be the code that he's working. I want to clear Carl's name. His right and wrong should balance out. Because right and wrong should balance out, I have to act. All of those things tie together into forming this code. And eventually the code includes acting to take care of Jeremy, All of those tie together. So he does have this personal code. And finally, the police procedural. Obviously, Joe's not a police officer. We're not necessarily solving multiple crimes simultaneously, or the police aren't. We kind of tie that in at the very end, but I don't think that's a big part of it. The cops just aren't the focus. Certainly, the details of official investigations come into play. The autopsies and the gathering of evidence and warrants and come into play. But I think the bigger stuff is like, despite the hard work, the case may be solved by a lucky break. Page 198, how did you figure out the code? My autistic brother. Uh, Sorry for the spelling there. I will go back and correct it for class. Uh, and the idea of just lucky comes into play. And the drudgery of police work, page 185 and 186, digging the file out of the basin, going through and verifying that what you're saying is even close to being true, whether other evidence there might be. Evidence has to be strong enough to convince my boss, then my boss has to convince the county auditor, and it just kind of keeps going. Finally, I want to spend a little time talking about Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal gets mentioned in the novel. It's Pascal's Gambit. We're talking about whether there's heaven and hell, and Carl talking about this might be our heaven. I'm not sure it deals with Pascal quite fairly, so let's run through. Pascal has these options. God exists, God does not exist. You believe, you don't believe. Pascal says that if you believe and God exists, you get infinite joy. If you believe and God does not exist, there was a finite cost, and it's not a big deal. If you don't believe and God exists, there's infinite pain. And if you do believe and God exists, there's finite gain. And so Pascal was a gambler. He was a great philosopher. He invented what was the first adding machine, but he was a gambler. And as a gambler, he tried to play the odds all the time. And so he works out this wager, rolls the dice with God, if nothing else, and comes to these conclusions. Some of you may have seen Pascal in your high school math classes. He's famous for what's called Pascal's triangle. And the idea is, as you kind of run through the triangle, you add stuff together. So, for example, if you look at the second row, you have 1 plus 1. The white square below it gives you 2. If you add 1 plus 2, the square below it gives you 3. If you add 3 plus 3, the square below it gives you 6. If you add 6 plus 4, you get 10. If you add 10 plus 10, you get 20. As you see those white squares and those triangles, and Pascal put this triangle together as a way of playing the odds, as a way of, when he was gambling, playing the odds of what card might come up. And so I think it's important to understand that he was a famous mathematician, and that his philosophical contributions were perhaps a little deeper than Carl let on. I think that's going to wrap it up here for today. Remember the due dates. And those of you watching in Group A, I hope to see all of you in class on Wednesday. And hope all of you stay warm. It's going to be a cold week. Oops, I'm sorry. I forgot the daily writing. Hang with me here. Daily writing is, what's the best part of the life we bury? Follow the basic claim data warrant paragraph format. Just one sentence with what's the best part. Give a couple concrete details and explain how the details illustrate that it's the best part of the novel. Now, I hope you all have a good week. Sorry for that before, and we'll see you Wednesday.